Tonight, someone somewhere will post a photo of a person they lost, a candle emoji, a few words, maybe a string of hearts in the comments. You've seen it 100 times. You've probably done it yourself. It feels modern. It feels like something only a person with a phone could do. But the real answer is far stranger. 60,000 years before phones, before candles, a group of humans knelt beside a body in a cave and did almost the same thing. You just don't know their names. Let's go back. Not centuries, tens of thousands of years, back to a cave in the Zagros Mountains in what is now northern Iraq. Archaeologists call it Shanidar Cave. Inside it, they found the bones of a Neanderthal man curled on his side. Around him, buried in the soil, were traces of pollen. Not one flower, clusters of them. Yarrow, cornflower, hollyhock. For a moment, imagine that. A group of Neanderthals standing in a cave, placing flowers around a dead body. You were taught Neanderthals were brutish, slow, barely human. But someone in that cave chose flowers. Someone decided this body mattered enough to be surrounded by color before it went into the ground. Why? Because grief is not new. Grief might be older than language itself. The archaeologist Ralph Solecki, who first excavated Shanidar Cave in the 1950s, called it evidence of compassion in prehistoric humans. Not every researcher agreed the pollen was placed deliberately. Some argued it could have blown in or been carried by burrowing rodents. But even the debate tells you something. The idea that a Neanderthal might have grieved was controversial. Not because it was impossible, because it forced you to see them as people. Here's the part that should stop you. You assume ancient humans handled death simply. Bury it. Move on, survive. That's the story evolution supposedly demands. No time for ceremony when you're one bad hunt away from starving. But the evidence says otherwise. Go further back, nearly 100,000 years, to a site called Qafzeh Cave in modern-day Israel. There, early humans buried a child with deer antlers pressed into their hands. Not tossed in. Placed. Positioned. Someone knelt down after this child died and arranged antlers in small, cold fingers. Ask yourself, why would you do that if the only goal was to get rid of a body? You wouldn't. You'd do it because something in you refused to let the moment end without meaning. The archaeologist Paul Pettitt, who has spent decades studying Paleolithic burial, argues that these early burials weren't just about disposal. They were about marking a boundary, a line between the world of the living and whatever came next. Objects buried with a body, a specific position, curled like sleep, red ochre pigment, sometimes rubbed across the bones, the color of blood, the color of life, pressed onto something that no longer had any. Red ochre shows up again and again at ancient burial sites, across continents, across tens of thousands of years, long before any of these groups could have shared the idea with each other, which means something extraordinary. Different humans in different corners of the world, isolated by mountains and oceans and time, independently arrived at the same instinct: cover the dead in the color of life, as if grief invented the same ritual twice, 3 times, a dozen times, without anyone teaching it to anyone else. You inherited that instinct. You just don't recognize it anymore. Think about a funeral you've attended. The flowers on the casket, the specific outfit someone was buried in, the photograph propped beside the guest book. None of that is required for a body to be disposed of. A hole in the ground would do the job. But you don't stop at the job. You never have. Now here's the twist that changes everything. For most of human history, death wasn't an ending. Not the way you think of it. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies, both ancient and those still living today, have found a consistent theme. The dead were not erased from daily life. They were relocated, moved into a different relationship with the living, but not removed from it. In some early societies, the bones of ancestors were kept close. Skulls reburied under the floor of a home, bones carried during migrations, not out of horror, out of belonging. The dead were still part of the group, still consulted in a sense, still spoken to. This is where modern psychology quietly agrees with prehistoric practice. For decades, grief researchers assumed the healthy way to grieve was to let go, detach from the person you lost and move forward. That was the model taught in psychology for most of the 20th century. But in the 1990s, psychologists Dennis Klass, Phyllis Silverman, and Stephen Nickman challenged that entirely. They introduced what's now called continuing bonds theory. Their research found that people who maintained an ongoing connection to someone they lost often coped better than those who tried to sever the tie completely. In other words, the instinct to keep the dead close isn't a failure to move on. It might be exactly what your brain evolved to do, which means that cave in the Zagros Mountains, and that grave in Qafzeh, and the flowers, and the red ochre, and the antlers pressed into small hands weren't primitive attempts at closure. They were the original blueprint, the first draft of something you're still doing every single day. Picture your phone again, the photo, the caption, the candle emoji. It isn't a modern invention layered on top of ancient simplicity. It's the same ritual wearing a different costume. You are not more evolved than the people who placed flowers around a body in a cave. You're running the same ancient software. Different hardware, same code. Here's something else worth sitting with. Anthropologists have long noted that societies without writing, without permanent monuments, without any way to leave a lasting physical record, still found ways to make sure their dead were not forgotten. Oral storytelling, naming children after ancestors, passing down specific objects generation after generation so that a person's presence outlived their body. You do the same thing when you tell a story about someone at their funeral, when you name your child after a grandparent, when you keep a ring, a photo, a voicemail. You can't bring yourself to delete. None of it is new. All of it is inherited. Somewhere in your evolutionary history, a version of you that had no words, no writing, no technology, still understood something you're only now beginning to articulate. That death does not have to mean disappearance. That memory can be a kind of survival. That grief expressed through ritual, through objects, through color and flowers and position is not weakness. It's one of the oldest technologies humans ever built. Not fire, not tools. Grief rituals may be just as old, just as essential, just as human. So tonight, when someone posts that photo, that candle, that string of hearts, you'll know what you're really looking at. Not a modern habit. A memory older than language, reaching back through tens of thousands of years, through caves and pollen and red ochre and antlers pressed into small, cold hands, to remind you of something ancient humans somehow already understood. The dead don't disappear. You just have to decide how you'll keep them close.